The snow came without warning that year. It fell the way silence falls, slowly at first, then all at once, until the entire world outside the palace gates was swallowed in white. No wind, no sound, just the soft, relentless burial of everything that had once been alive. The gardens that travelers used to stop and admire from the road were gone beneath it. The iron fountain at the center of the courtyard, the one carved in the shape of a falcon mid-flight, stood frozen in place, its wings outstretched but going nowhere, like something caught between escape and surrender. This was Voss Manor, and even before you reached its gates, you could feel it, that particular heaviness in the air that has no name, but that the body understands immediately. A weight, a warning. The kind of place that doesn't simply exist, but presses in on you, reminding you with every breath that you are a guest here and that guests are only ever tolerated for so long. The servants talked, as servants always do. The servants talked in the kitchens when the fire burned low. The servants talked in the corridors with their heads bent close, their voices barely above a breath, their eyes moving toward the upper staircase, the way eyes move toward a storm gathering at the edge of the sky. The servants had learned, over time, to speak without moving their lips too much. Sound carried strangely in Voss Manor. Sound had a way of finding the one person you least wanted to hear it. The servants said the Duke was cursed. Not in the way people said such things about powerful men they feared or resented, not a curse of character or reputation. The servants meant it in the oldest sense of the word. Something had been done to the Duke, or something had found him, and whatever it was, it had not finished its work. The Duke had been sick for years, the servants said. Not sick the way ordinary men were sick, with fevers that broke and wounds that closed. Sick the way old trees were sick, from the inside out, rotting at the core while the exterior still held its shape. The Duke still walked. The Duke still commanded. The Duke still signed documents and issued orders and sat at the head of that long, cold dining table every evening, whether or not there was anyone to eat with him. But the color had left his face years ago, and the warmth had followed shortly after. The servants said the Duke had been different once. The older ones remembered Mrs. Holt, who had managed the household since before the Duke's father died, and old Garrett, who trimmed the hedges in summer and now spent most of his days sitting by the fire, doing nothing, because the hedges had not been trimmed in 3 winters. Mrs. Holt and Garrett remembered a boy who laughed, who ran down these same corridors and slid in his socks across the marble floors and climbed the bookshelves like they were mountains waiting to be conquered. Mrs. Holt and Garrett remembered the way his eyes used to catch the light. Those eyes were still the same shade of gray, but the light in them had been replaced by something else. Distance, perhaps, or pain that had been lived with so long it had stopped announcing itself and simply become part of the furniture. His name was Duke Aldrich Voss. Aldrich was 31 years old, and Aldrich had not permitted a single person to touch his hand in over 2 years. The physicians came and went. The physicians arrived with their leather cases and their measured expressions and their careful language, and the physicians left with those same measured expressions, only tighter, more controlled, the way a man controls his face when he has news he does not want to deliver. The physicians wrote prescriptions that helped nothing. The physicians recommended rest Aldrich would not take. The physicians suggested warmer climates and fresh air and a reduction of stress, which Aldrich received with a look so dry and so withering that 2 of the physicians had never returned for a second visit. The disease had no satisfying name. The disease began in the chest. A tightening, the physicians explained, of the blood vessels closest to the heart. A narrowing that could not be reversed, only managed, and only for a time. The disease made Aldrich pale. The disease made Aldrich cold. On bad days, the disease made breathing itself an act of concentration. Each inhale something Aldrich had to think about and choose, the way you choose to keep climbing when the mountain is not finished with you yet. The disease gave Aldrich pain at unpredictable hours, the kind that arrived without announcement and left when it felt like leaving, indifferent to his schedule or his dignity. Aldrich never spoke about it, not once. Not to Mrs. Holt, who had known Aldrich his entire life. Not to his physician, Dr. Crane, beyond what was clinically necessary. Not to the lawyers who came periodically to review the estate's affairs with the solemnity of men attending a funeral they expected to repeat soon. Aldrich especially did not speak about the loneliness. But the manor spoke about it for him. Rooms that had once been occupied were locked now. The music room, where Aldrich's mother used to play the harpsichord on winter afternoons, sat sealed at the end of the east corridor, its door swollen with disuse, the instrument inside presumably still tuned to whatever chord Aldrich's mother had last played before she died. The guest quarters were empty. The dining room, despite being set each evening, held the silence of a room that had given up expecting company. The servants left, one by one, not dramatically. Not in protest or with grand speeches about what the servants would and would not endure. The servants simply stopped appearing for morning duties, and when Mrs. Holt went to their quarters, Mrs. Holt would find the rooms stripped bare. The keys laid on the nightstand with the quiet finality of people who had made a decision and did not wish to argue about it. There was always a letter, usually brief, usually polite, always containing some variation of the same sentiment. Family circumstances, other arrangements, deeply sorry, thank you for the opportunity. By the beginning of that winter, there were 11 servants left in a manor that had once employed 43. Mrs. Holt posted notices in 3 nearby villages. Mrs. Holt offered wages above market rate, which Aldrich authorized without blinking, because the one thing Aldrich Voss had never lacked was money. What Aldrich lacked was people willing to be near him long enough to spend it. Most applicants came. Most applicants left within the week. Aldrich was not cruel in the theatrical sense. Aldrich did not shout. Aldrich did not throw things. Aldrich was cold in the way that deep water is cold. Not dramatic about it, not hostile in any personal way. Simply a temperature that the human body was not designed to survive in indefinitely. Aldrich spoke in clipped sentences. Aldrich made no inquiries about anyone's well-being. Aldrich expected perfection and registered imperfection with a silence that was, somehow, worse than any reprimand. Aldrich looked at people, when Aldrich looked at people at all, as though they were furniture that had been placed in the wrong room. And Aldrich was still deciding whether it was worth the effort to move them. The servants found it unbearable. The ones who stayed did so for the wages or out of loyalty, so old it had calcified into something closer to stubbornness. Mrs. Holt, chief among them, who had, by this point, lived with Aldrich's silences long enough to have learned how to breathe inside them. Mrs. Holt was the one who opened the door on the 3rd morning of December, to a young woman standing on the front step with a canvas bag over one shoulder and snow in her dark hair, her cheeks red from the cold, and her expression suggesting Elise had not traveled this far in this weather to be turned away. Her name was Elise Morin. Elise was 23 years old. Elise came from the village of Callow, which was not quite close and not quite far, and which was the kind of place that produced people with a very clear understanding of what hard work looked like, because the people of Callow had been watching it their entire lives. Elise's father, Thomas Morin, had worked a small plot of land for 30 years and had managed to make something out of it through the particular combination of stubbornness and pragmatism that farming demanded. Not enough to be comfortable, never quite enough for that, but enough to keep the four of them housed and fed through most seasons. Elise's mother, Agnes, had a face that had been weathered into something handsome by years of outdoor work and indoor worry. And Agnes had stood in the doorway of their small house the morning Elise left, and gripped Elise's wrist with both hands, and said, with the kind of directness that comes from having no time or patience for gentle delivery, "That place will destroy you. Leave while you still can." Elise had kissed Agnes on the cheek and said Elise would be careful. Agnes had not looked reassured. Thomas had walked Elise to the edge of the road and said very little, because Thomas was a man who processed his fear through silence, and Thomas was, at that moment, very afraid. Thomas had heard the stories about Voss Manor, the same as everyone else in Callow. Stories had a way of traveling faster and arriving in worse condition than the truth they started from. So Thomas could not say with certainty what was real and what had been embellished by 3 successive retellings. But the core of it, the Duke, the sickness, the servants who kept leaving, that part seemed consistent across all versions. Thomas pressed a small amount of money into Elise's hand and told Elise to keep it hidden and to use it to come home if Elise needed to come home. No questions, no judgment. Elise took the money and told Thomas she loved him and walked toward a manor Elise had never seen but had heard about all her life, and Elise felt, with every step closer, not the fear her parents expected Elise to feel, but something closer to determination. The particular determination of someone who has looked at an impossible situation and decided that impossible is not the same as insurmountable. Mrs. Holt looked at Elise in the doorway for a long moment. Mrs. Holt had seen many applicants by this point. Mrs. Holt had developed, over the weeks, a specific and not inaccurate sense for which applicants would last. It had something to do with the eyes. Not confidence exactly, but a quality beneath confidence, something more durable. The ones who left quickly usually had a brightness in their eyes on the first day that was essentially performance. The ones who stayed had something quieter. Something that had already done the work of expecting difficulty. Elise's eyes had that quality. Mrs. Holt stepped aside and let Elise in. The interior of Voss Manor was, if anything, more oppressive than the exterior suggested. It was not dilapidated. Aldrich's money ensured that surfaces were cleaned and fixtures were maintained, and the structural business of a functioning household was attended to. But Voss Manor had the feeling of a place that had stopped trying to be warm and had settled, instead, for being preserved. The drapes were heavy and dark. The portraits on the walls, mostly of Voss ancestors in various states of sober distinction, and stared down with expressions that seemed to have been rendered specifically to discourage comfort. The fireplaces were lit but gave off heat that seemed to stop 2 feet in front of them, as though even the warmth here was constrained by some unspoken rule. Mrs. Holt walked Elise through the ground floor, explaining the structure of duties in the brisk, informational tone of a woman who had long since given up on making orientation pleasant. The cooking was handled by a man named Bernard, who arrived at 6 and left at 8 and interacted with no one if Bernard could help it. The laundry was managed by a woman named Ruth, who was deaf in one ear and efficient to a degree that bordered on frightening. Elise's duties would involve the upper floors: cleaning, maintaining, and attending to Aldrich's personal quarters when required, which Mrs. Holt indicated with a significant pause, was something to be done quickly and without drawing attention to oneself. "Aldrich does not like to be observed," Mrs. Holt said, which Elise found to be an unusual way to describe a man living in his own home. "Does Aldrich speak to the staff?" Elise asked. Mrs. Holt looked at Elise sideways. Aldrich gives instructions. Does Aldrich ask questions about how people are? Does Aldrich— No, said Mrs. Holt, with the patience of someone explaining something for the 100th time. Aldrich does not. Elise considered this for a moment, then nodded, as though Elise had filed it under useful information rather than alarming information, which was precisely where Elise had filed it. Elise did not meet Duke Aldrich Voss until the second day. Elise was in the upper corridor outside the library, running a cloth along the window ledge, when Elise heard footsteps on the staircase. Unhurried, deliberate, the footsteps of someone who had never in their life felt the need to rush for another person's convenience. Elise turned. Aldrich was taller than Elise had expected. That was the first thing. Elise had imagined the sick man from the stories to be diminished somehow, to occupy less space. But Aldrich Voss occupied a great deal of space, even wrapped in the dark wool overcoat Aldrich wore indoors against the cold. Aldrich seemed to carry with him everywhere. Aldrich's hair was black, shot through at the temples with something lighter, and Aldrich's face was the face of a man who had been handsome once in a conventional way, and was still handsome now, though the illness had refined it past the point of approachability. Cheekbones too prominent, jaw too sharp, shadows beneath the eyes that spoke of nights spent in negotiations with pain rather than in sleep. Aldrich's eyes found Elise immediately, gray and very still. "You're new," Aldrich said. It was not a question. It was not a greeting. It was the verbal equivalent of noting a piece of furniture in the wrong room. "Elise Morin?" Elise said. "I arrived yesterday." Aldrich said nothing to that. Aldrich looked at Elise for a moment longer, not appraising, not hostile, simply looking, with the flat attention of someone cataloging rather than perceiving. And then Aldrich walked past Elise toward the library without another word, and the door closed behind Aldrich. Elise turned back to the window ledge and continued with her cloth. Elise was not shaken. This surprised the other servants, who had watched from the end of the corridor with the collective tension of people waiting to see whether someone would survive an encounter with something dangerous. Ruth, who had seen 3 new girls flee within their first week, raised an eyebrow. Old Garrett, who spent most of his time near the fire, stared at Elise with an expression Elise couldn't quite read. "Aldrich looked at you longer than Aldrich looks at most," Ruth said that evening. "Aldrich was just seeing if I was new," Elise said, which was true, and also, Elise sensed, not entirely the whole truth. But Elise set that aside for now. The first week was, by any objective measure, difficult. Aldrich ran his household the way a cold front ran across open water, without malice, without personal investment in the discomfort it caused, but relentlessly and with no apparent awareness that anyone might prefer otherwise. Aldrich's instructions came through Mrs. Holt mostly, but on the occasions when Aldrich issued instructions directly, the instructions came in the precise, uninflected tone of a man who had never once considered that the human on the receiving end of an order might have an internal experience worth accounting for. The fire in the West reading room was never to be higher than a certain level, because the smoke bothered Aldrich's lungs. The windows in Aldrich's private study were to be cleaned on Tuesdays, and only Tuesdays, because Aldrich worked in that room every other day and did not want the disruption. Aldrich's meals were to arrive at exact times and be removed if Aldrich had not appeared within 20 minutes, without any attempt to retrieve Aldrich or remind Aldrich, because Aldrich found both retrieval and reminders to be an intrusion on his autonomy that Aldrich had not asked for and would not tolerate. The first time Elise made a mistake. Elise had opened the curtain in Aldrich's study 2 inches further than it was supposed to be opened. Elise had not known about the curtain rule. Mrs. Holt had mentioned it in orientation, but in the context of 6 other rules delivered in rapid succession, and Elise's memory, while good, was not flawless. Elise discovered the error when Aldrich appeared in the doorway of the study while Elise was still in the room, looked at the curtain, looked at Elise, and said, in a voice that contained no volume but considerable weight, "The curtain." "I'm sorry," Elise said. Don't apologize," Aldrich said. "Correct it." Elise corrected it. Aldrich walked to his desk and sat down and did not look at Elise again. Elise left the room with the particular combination of embarrassment and irritation that comes from being corrected correctly. Knowing the person who corrected Elise was right, but resenting, nonetheless, the manner of it. Elise stood in the corridor for a moment with her jaw set, and then Elise exhaled slowly and went back to her duties, because what else was there to do? In the weeks that followed, there were more incidents. Aldrich spoke to Elise in clipped commands when Elise was unfortunate enough to be present for something Aldrich needed done. Aldrich never raised his voice. Aldrich never used Elise's name after that first day in the corridor. Only "you" or an indicative gesture, or on one occasion when Elise had arrived with Aldrich's evening tea, a full 7 minutes late, because Elise had been helping Ruth carry something heavy up from the cellar. A silence so complete and so pointed that the tea tray began shaking slightly in Elise's hands, which infuriated Elise almost more than words would have. Elise did not react with fear, and this, more than anything, seemed to confuse the other servants watching Elise. Elise reacted with something closer to patience, a measured, deliberate patience that was not the same as deference, because Elise was not afraid of Aldrich, and the patience that came from fear looked different from the patience that came from having already decided that a person's worst behavior was not necessarily the truest version of them. Elise had not decided yet what the truest version of Aldrich Voss looked like. Elise was still collecting information. And Aldrich. Though Aldrich showed none of it, though Aldrich's face remained as closed and as distant as ever during these small daily encounters, had begun to notice things. Small things. The way Elise moved through a room without disturbing it. The way Elise did not flinch when Aldrich walked in unexpectedly. The way Elise spoke, when Elise did speak, directly and without the performative deference that some of the other servants used, as though expecting that flatness of tone to somehow shield them from Aldrich's notice. Elise did not seem to be trying to become invisible. Elise seemed, rather, to have made a quiet decision that being present in a place was its own justification, and that Elise would not apologize for existing in rooms Aldrich occupied. Aldrich found this in the small hours of one sleepless night, when the pain in Aldrich's chest was particularly insistent, and the silence of the manor was particularly loud, to be, and this word arrived with the force of something Aldrich had not expected, interesting. Aldrich shut the thought down immediately. Elise was staff. Elise would stay for a month or perhaps 2, and then Elise would add her key to the pile on the nightstand, and there would be another polite, brief letter, and Elise would be gone, and Voss Manor would continue doing what it did best. Waiting, in silence, for the inevitable end of the thing that lived inside it. Aldrich told himself this, and turned over in his bed and waited for morning. It began with a glass of water. This is how the smallest things always begin, the largest changes, not with declarations or dramatic gestures, but with something so ordinary that neither person involved registers it as a beginning at all. A glass of water. A cold night in the middle of January. The kind of night where the wind pressed against the manor walls with something close to anger, and the fires in every room worked twice as hard and still lost the argument. Elise had heard it from the corridor. Elise had been returning from the laundry room, no later than Elise should have been because a pile of linens had come undone on the staircase, and Elise had spent 20 minutes refolding them in the dark with fingers that had gone stiff from the cold of the lower floor. Elise was tired. Elise was thinking about her bed and the 2 blankets Elise had taken to layering over each other since December, and the particular relief of horizontal stillness after a long day of vertical effort. And then Elise heard it. A sound Elise hadn't heard before. A sharp, involuntary sound, brief and immediately suppressed, from behind the door of Aldrich's private study at the end of the corridor. Not a crash. Not something breaking. Something more private than that. The sound a person makes when pain arrives without warning, and that person is alone and believes they can afford to be honest about it for just 1 second before reassembling. Elise stopped walking. Elise stood in the corridor for a moment, listening to the silence that followed. And then Elise made a decision Elise had not thought through, and that Elise suspected Elise would not be thanked for, and Elise knocked. No answer. Elise knocked again, lighter, and said through the door, "Your Grace, I wanted to make sure." Silence. Then, "Go to bed." Aldrich's voice was controlled but had, at its edges, the roughness of something that had been through a difficult hour. Elise stood for another moment, and then Elise said, "I'll leave water by the door." Elise went to the kitchen, filled a glass, came back, set the glass quietly on the floor outside the study door, and went to bed. In the morning, the glass was empty. Elise collected it without comment. Aldrich said nothing about it, but 3 nights later, when Elise was passing that same corridor at the same late hour, Elise noticed the light still burning under the study door, which meant Aldrich was still awake, which meant the nights were still difficult. Elise went to the kitchen. Elise brought water. Elise set the glass down. Elise left. This became, without either of them naming it, a pattern. Elise never knocked after that first night. Elise never announced herself. Elise simply left the glass, and in the morning the glass was empty, and neither Elise nor Aldrich spoke about it during the day. And the silence between them in daylight hours remained as it had always been. Aldrich's clipped and deliberate, Elise's patient and without ceremony. But there was something in it now that had not been there before. A small adjustment, a frequency shift, so subtle that probably neither Elise nor Aldrich could have identified it at the time. The other servants noticed, because the other servants noticed everything. Ruth mentioned it to old Garrett in the kitchen one morning, while Bernard was grinding something loudly enough to drown out their conversation. Ruth said it in the way of someone reporting a curiosity rather than offering a judgment. The new girl, the water, the empty glass. Garrett listened without expression, and then said only, "Elise is still here." As though that itself was the more significant data point. February arrived, and the cold deepened. Aldrich's illness went through one of its periodic worsening phases, which Mrs. Holt had learned to track not by anything Aldrich said. Aldrich never said anything, but by the particular quality of Aldrich's footstep in the morning, which became, on the bad days, slightly more measured, the way a man walks when he is distributing weight carefully, managing something beneath the surface that his exterior has been instructed to ignore. On one of those bad days, Aldrich did not come down to dinner. This happened occasionally, though Mrs. Holt usually received word through the usual channels. A note slid under Mrs. Holt's office door, or a brief instruction delivered via the bell system that still functioned in the manor's older wing. This time, there was nothing. The dinner sat at the table for 20 minutes and was removed, as per protocol, and Mrs. Holt went upstairs at 7 in the evening and stood outside Aldrich's bedroom door and said, "Your Grace, Bernard has prepared something if you—" "I'm aware," came Aldrich's voice from inside. "I'll eat later." Aldrich did not eat later. It was Elise who noticed the untouched tray outside Aldrich's door at 9 in the evening, still covered, the broth beneath the lid long since gone cold. Elise picked up the tray. Elise took the tray back to the kitchen. Elise reheated what could be reheated, made new what could not, put together something plain and something hot, and brought the tray back up. Elise set the tray outside the door. Elise did not knock. Elise went back downstairs. An hour later, the tray was outside the door again, and the tray was empty. Elise collected the tray without comment in the morning. Aldrich did not thank Elise. Elise had not expected Aldrich to. But the following Tuesday, when Elise came to clean the study windows, Elise found a small adjustment to the room. A chair that had previously been angled away from the window had been turned slightly toward it. It was such a minor change that it would have registered as meaningless to almost anyone else. Elise stood looking at the chair for a moment, then smiled very slightly to herself and began cleaning the windows. March came. The snow on the grounds began to retreat in patches. There was an afternoon, the kind that arrives in early spring with unexpected mildness, a gift from a season that is still mostly winter, but is testing the idea of becoming something else, where Elise was working in the upper garden, the small enclosed garden on the east side of the manor that had been left largely untended for years. Elise was not there as part of any assigned duty. Elise was there because the mild air had reached Elise through an open window, and Elise had followed it, practically without deciding to, the way you follow a smell from another room. Elise was clearing dead growth from what had once been a planter of herbs when Elise heard the door behind her. Elise turned. Aldrich was standing in the doorway between the garden and the manor's inner corridor. Aldrich was not wearing his overcoat, which was unusual. Aldrich's hands were at his sides. Aldrich looked at the garden with an expression Elise had not seen on Aldrich before, something private and not entirely comfortable. Like a man looking at something that used to belong to a version of himself Aldrich no longer had access to. Elise turned back to the planter and said nothing, which was the right instinct. Aldrich stood in the doorway for a while. Then Aldrich came into the garden and stood at the other end of it, near the wall where a climbing plant had died and left its skeleton on the stone in a pattern that looked almost deliberate. Aldrich looked at the dead branches. Aldrich said nothing. Elise worked. Aldrich stood. The afternoon moved slowly around both of them. After perhaps 20 minutes, Aldrich said, without looking at Elise, "My mother grew rosemary in that planter." Elise looked at the planter in her hands. Then Elise said, "I can find rosemary seeds, if you'd like." A pause. "It would take years to grow to anything worth having," Aldrich said. Elise considered this and then said, "Things usually do." Aldrich looked at Elise then, not the flat cataloging look of those first weeks, a different kind of looking. Brief, and then gone, Aldrich's gaze returning to the dead climbing plant on the wall, as though the exchange had not happened. But Aldrich stayed in the garden for another hour, and Aldrich came back the following afternoon, and the one after that. Elise and Aldrich did not have conversations exactly. Elise and Aldrich had something different, a shared occupation of space that included occasionally the exchange of sentences. Aldrich told Elise at one point that the climbing plant had been wisteria, planted by the groundskeeper who had left 3 years ago and whom Aldrich had not replaced. Elise told Aldrich at another point that Thomas grew lavender on the south side of the family house every year, and that the lavender came back reliably regardless of whether you paid attention to it. Aldrich said, "Lucky plant." Elise said, "Lucky family." Aldrich looked at Elise again after that one. Elise noticed. Elise was, by now, paying close attention to these glances, cataloging them the way a navigator catalogs stars. That when Aldrich looked at Elise this way, there was something in Aldrich's eyes that was neither the administrative assessment of the early weeks, nor the careful blankness Aldrich applied to most human interaction. It was something more unguarded, something that arrived before Aldrich could arrange his face. Elise did not comment on it. Elise filed it carefully away. The nights with the glass of water continued. Sometimes Elise heard nothing from the study. Sometimes Elise heard movement, or the occasional low sound of a man in pain trying to sound like a man doing something else. Once, in late March, Elise heard what Elise was certain was the sound of something being knocked from a desk, and then a silence of the specific length of a person sitting on the floor. Elise stood in the corridor with her hand raised to knock, and then Elise lowered her hand and set the water down and walked away, because Elise had understood by now something important about Aldrich Voss. That Aldrich had a boundary not around his cruelty or his coldness, both of which Aldrich wore plainly and without embarrassment, but around his vulnerability. That was the thing Aldrich had walled off. That was the room Aldrich would not allow visitors in under any circumstances. Elise was patient. Elise had not decided yet whether patience was the same as hope. Elise thought patience might be the precondition for it. But the cold did not leave Aldrich. The cold was in Aldrich in April and in May, and in the first warm weeks of June, when the grounds outside finally consented to bloom, and the rosemary Elise had planted in the east garden had pushed up its first small gray-green shoots, with the slow insistence of something that intended to be here for a long time. Aldrich had looked at those shoots one morning, and said nothing, and gone back inside, and Elise had not been able to read from Aldrich's back what the expression on Aldrich's face had been. Elise wished she had been standing in front of Aldrich. Elise was increasingly aware of how much information Elise tried to read from the back of Aldrich Voss, and how insufficient a source Aldrich's back was. The cold was in Aldrich and around Aldrich, and the illness made it worse, and there were days when Aldrich's control slipped. Not often, not dramatically, but Elise had been here long enough now to feel the shape of Aldrich's bad days, the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives. Something atmospheric. Something in the particular quality of Aldrich's footstep on the stair, or the angle of light from under the study door in the small hours. On those days, Aldrich spoke even less. On those days, the silences were denser, more pressurized. One evening in June, Elise brought Aldrich's supper tray up because Bernard had left, and Mrs. Holt's knee had been bothering Mrs. Holt since morning. Elise carried the tray up the back staircase and came around the corridor and found Aldrich standing outside his study door with his hand against the wall. His head lowered, his breathing audible in a way it should not have been, and Elise stopped immediately. Aldrich heard Elise and straightened. Aldrich turned around. Aldrich looked at Elise across the corridor, and for 1 second, one unguarded, open second, Elise saw it, all of it. The exhaustion, the pain, the very specific loneliness of a person who has been sick for a long time and has made the decision to be sick alone and has not fully counted the cost of that decision. It was there in Aldrich's face, fully visible, for 1 second. And then, it was gone. "Set it down," Aldrich said, meaning the tray. Aldrich's voice was even, almost. Elise set the tray on the small table outside the study door. Elise straightened. Elise looked at Aldrich. Elise said, because Elise could not help it, because the 1 second of Aldrich's face was still in the room between them. "You don't have to do all of this alone, you know." The look Aldrich gave Elise was not angry. It was something more complicated. Something that understood what Elise was offering and had made a very deliberate decision not to take it. "Yes," Aldrich said, I do. And Aldrich picked up the tray and went inside and closed the door. Elise stood in the corridor for a long time. That night, Elise could not sleep. Elise lay in her small room at the back of the manor's upper floor and looked at the ceiling and turned the evening over in Elise's mind with the particular thoroughness of someone who is trying very hard to understand something that does not want to be understood. Elise thought about the 1 second of Aldrich's face. Elise thought about what Elise had seen in it and whether Elise was interpreting it correctly or projecting something onto Aldrich that Aldrich did not feel and had never claimed to feel. Elise thought about the rosemary. Elise thought about the turned chair. Elise thought about 4 months of empty water glasses collected in the early morning without comment. And Elise thought about the very clear, very honest way Aldrich had said, "Yes, I do." And as though the question Elise was asking, whether Aldrich needed to be alone in this, had already been answered long ago and was not open for reconsideration. Elise decided, lying there in the dark with the warm June air coming through the gap in her curtain, that Elise was tired. Not of Aldrich. Elise was not, Elise realized with some surprise, tired of Aldrich at all. Elise was tired of being in the proximity of a wall that would not move, tired of patience that did not know what it was waiting for, tired of learning the language of a person who spoke almost entirely in silences and then finding that the translation still told Elise nothing definitive. Elise was 23 years old. Elise had been here 6 months. Agnes had been right, probably, though not in the way Agnes had meant. This place had not destroyed Elise, but Voss Manor had gotten inside Elise in ways Elise had not anticipated and could not now simply choose to reverse. Elise needed to leave, not forever. Elise told herself that. Elise told herself it was a temporary withdrawal, a restoration of perspective, the kind of strategic retreat that any sensible person employed when a situation had gotten too tangled to be examined clearly from the inside. Elise told herself all of this, and Elise almost believed it. In the morning, Elise went to Mrs. Holt's office and stood in the doorway and said simply, "I'll be leaving at the end of the week." Mrs. Holt looked at Elise for a long moment with an expression that contained many things, most of them sad, and then Mrs. Holt nodded and said Mrs. Holt would prepare the final wages. Elise spent the rest of the week doing her work. Elise watered the rosemary. Elise cleaned the windows on Tuesday. Elise left the water by the study door each night and collected the empty glass each morning without variation. On the last morning, Elise did not say goodbye to Aldrich. Elise had thought about it. Elise had rehearsed it briefly, in the manner of someone who knows a thing needs to be said, and is trying to find a version of it that won't cost too much. But when the morning came, and Elise's bag was packed, and the manor was going through its quiet early routines, Elise found Elise did not have a version that cost nothing, and Elise was not prepared to pay the full price. Elise left a note with Mrs. Holt. The note said, "Thank you for the opportunity. Please make sure someone waters the rosemary." Elise walked out through the front door and down the steps and through the gate, and Elise did not look back, and the snow from December was long gone, and the iron falcon in the courtyard had thawed and was still not flying anywhere. And behind Elise, the manor received Elise's departure the way the manor received everything, in silence. Elise did not know that Aldrich had heard Elise's footsteps on the front stairs. Elise did not know that Aldrich had stood at the window of his study, the window Elise cleaned every Tuesday, and watched Elise go down the drive until Elise was past the gate and no longer visible. Elise did not know that Aldrich had stood there for a long time after, with his hand against the glass, looking at the empty stretch of road with the expression of a man who has just discovered that something Aldrich told himself Aldrich did not need was, in fact, the thing Aldrich could not do without. Aldrich did not go after Elise. Aldrich had known Elise would leave. Aldrich had always known Elise would leave. Everyone left, and Aldrich had built his entire approach to this fact around the principle that the correct response was to make the leaving as easy as possible by never giving anyone a reason to stay, because then the leaving was clean, and Aldrich did not have to feel it in any way that could not be managed. Aldrich had forgotten somehow to apply this principle to Elise Morin. Aldrich turned away from the window and went to his desk and sat down and opened the document Aldrich had been reviewing before Aldrich heard Elise's footsteps. Aldrich looked at the document for perhaps 10 minutes, and then Aldrich put the document down and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes and sat very still. Aldrich did not name what Aldrich was feeling. Aldrich had not had cause to practice naming it. Aldrich had, over the years, become very good at converting feeling into function. Pain became schedule, loneliness became productivity, fear became control. But this one did not convert. The feeling sat in the center of Aldrich's chest alongside the other thing that sat there, the medical one, the one with no satisfying name, and the two of them together made the room feel very large and very empty. The halls were quiet now, in a different way. Voss Manor had always been quiet. But there were different kinds of quiet, and Aldrich had not, before today, understood that the quiet of the past 6 months had been a different variety from the quiet of all the years before. There had been footsteps in it. There had been the occasional sound of someone in the garden. There had been a glass of water outside the study door each night, set down with a particular care that was not deference and not strategy, but something Aldrich now understood to be simply attention. Someone paying attention to the fact that Aldrich was a person who sometimes had a difficult night. No one had paid that kind of attention to Aldrich in a very long time. Aldrich stopped eating with any regularity. This was not a decision. It was a drift. Meals arrived, and Aldrich looked at them and was not interested, and after a while, Aldrich stopped looking. Mrs. Holt tried twice to address it and received responses so final in their brevity that Mrs. Holt did not try a third time. Dr. Thomas Crane came in late July and looked at Aldrich with the expression of a man who is trying to decide whether to say the thing he is thinking or the thing that will be received without incident, and chose the latter, and prescribed something Aldrich almost certainly would not take. The illness worsened with the speed of something that had been waiting for permission. Without the rhythm of those small human interruptions, the water, the afternoon in the garden, the meals left at Aldrich's door, there was nothing to measure time against, and Aldrich moved through August in a haze that was partly physical and partly something else. Aldrich noticed Elise's absence in specific places. In the east corridor at 9 in the evening when Aldrich walked past, and there was no glass on the floor. In the garden where the rosemary grew without anyone to speak near it. In the study where the chair was still turned slightly toward the window, angled as the chair had been the morning after the first night Elise left the water. Aldrich had not moved the chair back. Aldrich told himself this was an oversight. Aldrich told himself this in August and again in September, and had told himself this so many times by October that Aldrich had almost stopped believing it. The realization, when it came, was not a revelation so much as an acknowledgement of something Aldrich had been circling for months. The realization arrived quietly, the way conclusions arrive when you have been avoiding them long enough, not with the force of discovery, but with the weary dignity of something that had been waiting patiently for you to stop arguing and simply agree. Aldrich needed Elise. Aldrich sat with this for a long time in the study, at the desk, with his hands folded in front of him and the late autumn light coming through the clean windows that someone else was now cleaning on Tuesdays and not quite getting right. Aldrich sat with the realization and did not attempt to convert it or manage it or reduce it to something more portable. Aldrich needed Elise, and Elise was gone, and Aldrich had allowed Elise to go because Aldrich had genuinely, structurally believed, that the correct posture toward every person in his life was to make their departure as frictionless as possible, and Aldrich had applied this principle to someone who was apparently the exception to it. And now the manor was quieter than it had ever been, and the silence hurt in a way that the silence had not, before, hurt. This was new information. Aldrich was a man who used new information. Aldrich called for Mrs. Holt and asked, with no preface and no explanation, whether Mrs. Holt knew anything about the financial situation of the Moran family in Callow. Mrs. Holt looked at Aldrich from across the desk for a long moment. "I can inquire," Mrs. Holt said carefully. "Do that," Aldrich said. The information arrived within 2 weeks. The information arrived in the form of a brief report from the solicitor Aldrich kept in the town of Verne, who had been asked to look quietly into the matter and had done so with the professional discretion for which Aldrich paid the solicitor considerably. The report was 3 paragraphs. The report told Aldrich that Thomas Moran had taken a loan against his property the previous spring to cover costs associated with a damaged irrigation system. The loan was not large by Aldrich's standards. By Thomas Moran's standards, the loan was the difference between keeping the farm and losing it, and the payment schedule was the kind that started manageable and became, over the course of a year, something close to impossible. Aldrich read the report twice. Aldrich was not proud of what Aldrich did next. Aldrich understood with perfect clarity the nature of what Aldrich was doing, the moral texture of it, the way it would look from the outside, the way it would feel to Elise when Elise understood what had happened. Aldrich was not deceiving himself about any of this. Aldrich did it anyway. Aldrich wrote to Thomas Moran directly, under the solicitor's name, with an offer, the full remaining debt, cleared immediately in exchange for 1 year of service from Thomas's daughter at Voss Manor, at a wage that was, by any reasonable measure, generous. The letter was careful and formal, and made no mention of who had originated the request or why. The letter presented itself as an administrative matter, a staffing need at the manor, a financial arrangement mutually beneficial. Thomas Moran, who had been watching the debt column in the household ledger with the particular despair of a man watching something inevitable approach, agreed. Elise, when Thomas sat Elise down and explained the offer with an expression that contained both relief and guilt in equal measure, listened without speaking. Elise looked at Thomas's hands, which were the hands of a man who had been working land for 30 years and showed it. Elise looked at Agnes's face, which was doing its best to be neutral and not succeeding. Elise knew, without being told directly, whose offer it was. Elise sat for a long time in the kitchen of the family home, with the lamp burning low and the smell of whatever Agnes had made for dinner still in the air. And Elise thought about a man who had watched Elise leave from a window Elise cleaned every Tuesday, and who had then waited 4 months and then reached across the distance between them not with honesty, but with leverage. Elise should have been angry. Part of Elise was angry, but another part of Elise, the part that had spent 6 months learning the specific language of a man who could not say directly what Aldrich felt, and had spent 4 months watching Aldrich not say it, and had still, somehow, understood, recognized this for what it was. Not cruelty, desperation, selfish, misguided, morally complicated desperation, but desperation nonetheless. The action of someone who needed something and had no model for how to ask for it with his hands open, And so Aldrich had used the only tool Aldrich trusted. The one that came with a contract and a clear set of terms and no requirement to be vulnerable about the reasons. Elise thought about the rosemary. Elise thought about the turned chair. Elise thought about yes, I do. Elise told Thomas and Agnes that Elise would go. Agnes gripped Elise's wrist, as Agnes had done that December morning almost a year ago, and said nothing this time. There were no warnings left to give. Elise had heard them all, and gone anyway. And now, Elise was going again. And Agnes Morin was a practical woman who had spent 30 years being practical about things Agnes could not change. Agnes kissed Elise's forehead and let go. Elise packed her bag, the same canvas bag from December, and walked back toward Voss Manor on a cold October morning, with leaves on the road, and the sky the color of unpolished silver. Elise was not the same person who had arrived the first time. Elise understood more now. Elise understood the shape of what Elise was walking back into, which was not simply a job or a duty, but something considerably more tangled. Elise understood that Aldrich had brought Elise back through manipulation, and Elise intended to have something to say about that eventually. But Elise also understood that somewhere in that cold, quiet manor, a man who had no practice asking for what Aldrich needed had done the only thing Aldrich knew how to do. And Elise had decided, for reasons Elise was not entirely prepared to articulate to herself or anyone else, that this was worth going back for. The gate was open when Elise arrived. Elise did not know whether the gate was open because someone had seen Elise coming, or whether someone had forgotten to close the gate, or whether, in the days since Thomas had sent his reply, Aldrich had given a quiet instruction to leave the gate open. Elise walked through it. The iron falcon spread its wings above the frozen fountain, caught between flight and stillness, unchanged. Elise went inside. Mrs. Holt opened the door. Mrs. Holt looked at Elise standing on the front step with her canvas bag, and the October cold behind Elise and Elise's expression doing that thing Elise's expression did when Elise was processing something Elise had not prepared a response for. Then Mrs. Holt stepped aside, as Mrs. Holt had done the first time, and Elise walked back into Voss Manor. The interior was the same. Of course the interior was the same. It had been 4 months, not 4 decades, and Voss Manor was not the kind of place that changed itself for anyone. The heavy drapes were still heavy. The Voss ancestors still stared down from their frames with their inherited dissatisfaction. The fires worked their usual losing battle against the cold that lived in the walls. But something was different. Elise felt it before Elise could name it. A quality in the air, a particular tension, like the atmosphere of a room where something has just happened and the evidence is still settling. Elise could not have said what it was. Only that the manor felt aware of Elise in a way that an empty building should not. Elise would find out later that on the morning Thomas's reply had arrived, Aldrich had read the reply standing at his desk, and then stood motionless for a long time. And then Aldrich had gone to the east garden and stood in front of the rosemary planter for several minutes in the October cold without his overcoat, which had alarmed Mrs. Holt considerably. And then Aldrich had gone back inside without explanation. Elise did not find this out for some time. What Elise found out immediately was that Elise's old room had been prepared, not simply made up, but prepared, with a small additional lamp on the writing table and the window latch repaired, which the latch had not been before. Its broken mechanism, something Elise had mentioned once in passing to Ruth, and apparently to no one else. Someone had fixed the latch. Elise stood looking at the repaired latch for a moment, and set her bag down and said nothing. The first week was strange. Aldrich did not acknowledge Elise's return beyond a single encounter in the corridor on Elise's second day. Elise was carrying fresh linens from the upstairs cupboard, and Aldrich was coming from the direction of the library, and Elise and Aldrich met in the space outside the staircase landing where the corridor narrowed. Aldrich stopped. Elise stopped. Elise and Aldrich looked at each other across perhaps 4 feet of cold air, and the entire weight of what had happened since June, and what had happened before June, and what had happened in the kitchen of a farmhouse in Callow, when Thomas sat down across from Elise, with guilty relief on Thomas's face. Elise looked at Aldrich steadily and said, "We'll need to speak about the arrangement." Aldrich said, "Yes." And that was all, because 2 of the junior servants chose that precise moment to come up the back stairs, and the corridor was suddenly occupied by people who were not Elise and Aldrich moved aside to let Elise pass, and Elise moved past Aldrich, and the conversation was deferred. The conversation was deferred for 3 more days, during which Elise completed her duties with the same quiet efficiency as before, and left the water by the study door each night, and collected the empty glass each morning, and felt the specific strangeness of returning to a rhythm that had never been properly named. On the 4th day, Elise knocked on Aldrich's study door at 10 in the morning, which was not a time Aldrich expected interruptions, and when Aldrich said, "Come in," Elise came in and stood across the desk from Aldrich, and said without preface, "You should have asked." Aldrich looked at Elise. Aldrich had a pen in Aldrich's hand, and a document in front of Aldrich, and Aldrich set the pen down with the deliberateness of a man deciding to fully occupy this conversation, rather than keep 1 foot outside it. "I know," Aldrich said. This surprised Elise slightly, while Elise had expected more resistance. "My father's debt has been cleared," Elise said. "Yes," Aldrich said, "in exchange for a year of my service." "Yes," Aldrich said. Elise looked at Aldrich across the desk. "You could have written to me directly." A pause. "I could have," Aldrich said. "Why didn't you?" Aldrich held Elise's gaze. For a moment, Elise thought Aldrich would not answer, which was Aldrich's most common response to questions that required honesty about Aldrich's interior. But Aldrich said, with the deliberate flatness of a man delivering a fact he finds uncomfortable, "Because a direct request requires a direct answer, and I was not certain the answer would be yes." Elise absorbed this. Elise stood in the morning light of the study, with the clean windows behind Elise, and the turned chair in Elise's peripheral vision, and the rosemary growing in the garden below, and Elise looked at Aldrich, who had just told Elise, in the most technically honest and emotionally constipated way possible, that Aldrich had been afraid Elise would say no. "It might still be no," Elise said, "on certain terms." Aldrich nodded slowly. "Name them," Aldrich said. Elise named them. The terms were not unreasonable. Elise wanted honesty, in the administrative sense, if not in the deeper sense, Elise suspected Aldrich was not capable of yet. Elise wanted to be spoken to by name. Elise wanted the household to be managed with less of the punishing silence and more of the plain instruction, which Elise found Elise could work with. Elise did not name the larger things because Elise did not have language for them yet that Elise trusted, and because Elise was aware that pushing Aldrich toward the edge of what Aldrich could bear in any given conversation was a reliable way to lose the conversation entirely. Aldrich agreed to the terms. Briefly, without elaboration, with the quality of a man signing a document that covers less than the full transaction, but is a starting point. Elise turned to leave. Aldrich said Elise's name. Elise turned back. "The rosemary," Aldrich said. Elise waited. "It grew," Aldrich said. "While you were gone, it came up well." Elise looked at Aldrich for a moment and felt something move in Elise's chest that Elise had been keeping very carefully still for the past several days. Elise said, "I know. I saw it when I came through the garden." Aldrich nodded. Aldrich picked up his pen. Elise left. Elise stood in the corridor outside the study, with her back against the wall and her eyes on the ceiling for a moment, breathing, and then Elise picked herself back up and went back to work. What followed was different from what had come before. The change was subtle. Elise doubted the other servants noticed most of it. Mrs. Holt noticed, because Mrs. Holt noticed everything, and because Mrs. Holt had known Aldrich for 30 years and had a finely calibrated sense for the difference between Aldrich's usual behavior and its variations. Aldrich used Elise's name. Not often, not with any warmth attached to it. Elise's name came out in the same precise, controlled tone as everything else Aldrich said. But Aldrich used the name, which was more than Aldrich did for anyone else in the household except Mrs. Holt. "Elise, set the fire lower. Elise." The window in the east corridor needs attention. Small things, administrative things, said with the correct name attached, which should have been unremarkable and was, somehow, not. Aldrich stopped letting the bad nights go unaddressed. Elise did not know this for some time because it happened indirectly. But in November, Elise discovered, through Ruth, who had discovered the fact through the domestic network that operates in any household between the official lines of communication, that Bernard had been quietly instructed to keep soup available at late hours. Not a general instruction. A specific instruction tied to no particular stated reason, say issued in the 3rd week of October around the time that Elise had returned to the manor. Elise filed this away. Elise filed away also the morning in November when Elise had been trying to move a heavy box of linens from the storage room to the upper floor and had found, at the bottom of the staircase, that the box had already been moved. No explanation. No one in the corridor. The box was simply at the top of the stairs, in the right place, as though the box had always been there. Elise had stood at the bottom of the staircase, looking up at the empty space where the box had been. And then Elise had looked up at the landing where the corridor led to the study and the bedroom and the rest of Aldrich's private territory. And Elise had thought, "Aldrich watched me try to move that, and then Aldrich moved it." But Elise did not know when Aldrich had slept. The nights continued their water-glass pattern. Elise brought the water. Aldrich drank it. Neither mentioned it. But sometime in November, Elise began to notice that the sound from the study on the bad nights had changed in quality. Less suppressed, slightly. Not more dramatic. Just less alone somehow, as though the knowledge that there was a glass outside the door had become part of how Aldrich managed the difficult hours, a small landmark in the dark. Elise stood in the corridor some nights and listened, not intrusively, just enough to take a reading, and then Elise set down the glass and went back to bed and lay there thinking about the very specific difficulty of loving someone who could only be loved at a distance and had not yet understood that this was what was happening. Elise did not use that word to herself directly. Not yet. Elise rotated around it. Elise observed it from various angles. Elise acknowledged its probable existence the way you acknowledge the approach of something large and inevitable before you have fully decided whether to move toward it or away. December came again. 1 year since Elise had arrived. Aldrich gave Elise, without explanation, a small practical gift. Nothing romantic, nothing that could not be categorized as a household provision. A new pair of work gloves, left on the table outside Elise's room in the morning, no note. Elise picked the gloves up and turned them over in Elise's hands and thought about a man who wanted very badly to give someone something and had chosen, with enormous care, a thing that could plausibly be interpreted as purely practical. Elise put the gloves on. The gloves fit exactly. Aldrich had noticed the size of Elise's hands at some point without Elise's knowledge. Elise wore the gloves for the rest of that winter. Elise began to understand, over the months of that second phase, the full dimensions of what Aldrich was doing. This hidden, careful, unspeakable thing that Aldrich had no name for and would not have claimed if asked. The thing had its own language. The moved box, the fixed window latch, the soup at late hours, the chair still angled toward the light. The rosemary that someone had tended in Elise's absence, badly, with the slightly overwatered look of someone who had looked up instructions rather than having any instinct for it, but tended nonetheless. Aldrich was loving Elise in the only way Aldrich knew. From the edges of things, without announcement, through actions that had enough plausible administrative cover that Aldrich never had to be directly vulnerable about them. Aldrich was doing it with the specific care of a man who believed, at a foundational level, that if the thing was ever named, something about it would break. Elise understood this. Elise let it be what it was. But Elise was watching Aldrich more carefully now. And what Elise watched concerned Elise. January of the new year was not kind to Aldrich Voss. The illness, which had done its worsening quietly through the autumn, became something less quiet in January. Elise noticed it first in Aldrich's color, which had always been pale, but became in those weeks something closer to translucent, the kind of pallor that suggested the body was beginning to make decisions about where to direct its remaining resources. Elise noticed it in Aldrich's breathing, which was occasionally audible at rest, a thing it should not have been. A thing Elise caught once while passing the open library door, and turned toward, and then kept walking, because Elise knew that Aldrich would hear Elise if Elise stopped. Elise noticed it in Aldrich's hands. Elise had been bringing Aldrich's afternoon documents to the study, a new duty that had emerged gradually from some unspoken negotiation between Elise and Aldrich. And Elise had set the documents on Aldrich's desk, and Aldrich had reached for them, and Aldrich's hands had been shaking. Not dramatically. A fine tremor, the kind you would miss if you were not paying the specific kind of attention Elise had developed over a year and 4 months in Aldrich's proximity. Ms. Elise had set the documents down and straightened and said nothing and left. Elise went to Mrs. Holt that evening. Elise said, "How bad is it?" Mrs. Holt looked at Elise from across the small office desk with an expression that had given up on pretending. "Dr. Crane came in November," Mrs. Holt said. "Dr. Crane's exact words to me were that Aldrich's condition had progressed significantly." "What does that mean?" Elise said. Mrs. Holt said nothing for a moment. Then, "It means that the estimate Dr. Crane gave us 2 years ago has been revised downward." Elise sat very still. "How far downward?" Elise said. Mrs. Holt pressed her lips together. "Dr. Crane said perhaps a year, perhaps less, depending on how the winter goes." Elise looked at the wall. Elise looked at the wall for a long time, at the unremarkable wallpaper of Mrs. Holt's small office, and Elise felt something move through Elise that was not quite grief because Aldrich was still alive, and not quite fear because Elise had known something was wrong, and not quite anger because there was no one to direct it at. It was something in between all of those things, a compound feeling. The feeling of someone who has spent a very long time learning the landscape of a person and has just been told that the landscape has an end. "Does Aldrich know you told me this?" Elise said. "No," said Mrs. Holt. "Does Aldrich know how bad it is?" A pause. "Aldrich knows," Mrs. Holt said. Elise went back to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and did not cry. Elise was not a person who cried easily, which had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with temperament. Elise processed inward rather than outward. Always turned things over until they were worn smooth, which took time and was not always comfortable, but was how Elise had always been. Elise sat with what Mrs. Holt had told Elise, and Elise turned it over. Aldrich knew he was dying. Aldrich had known, probably, since before Elise arrived. Or arrived at a certainty Aldrich could not contest sometime in the months before. And Aldrich had spent those months, both times Elise had been here, across the full span of everything that had happened between Elise and Aldrich, hiding it. Not from professional necessity or social convention. Aldrich had been hiding it specifically from Elise. Hiding it because if Elise knew, Elise would worry, and Aldrich had made a decision, somewhere in the private architecture of himself, that Elise's worry was something Aldrich was responsible for preventing, was because Aldrich cared about Elise. In Aldrich's language, with Aldrich's limitations, through the moved boxes and the repaired latches and the gloves that fit exactly, through the glass of water received each night across more than a year of difficult nights. Aldrich cared about Elise. Elise knew this, the way you know the weight of something when you've been carrying it for a long time. Not because Aldrich had ever said it, because Elise had been paying attention. And now Aldrich was dying, and Aldrich was going to die alone, and Aldrich had constructed the entire thing so that Elise would not have to be present for it, because that was what Aldrich believed caring about Elise required. Elise wanted to put her fist through the wall. Elise did not put her fist through the wall. Elise sat on the edge of her bed until Elise had her face arranged the way Elise needed it, and then Elise went back to work. What followed was a negotiation Elise conducted entirely with herself over the remaining weeks of winter. A conversation about what Elise was prepared to do and what Elise was prepared to say, and how much of the truth Elise was willing to surface in a relationship that had conducted itself almost entirely in subtext. Elise could not tell Aldrich that Elise knew. If Elise told Aldrich that Elise knew, Aldrich would close completely, would pull every one of Aldrich's carefully maintained distances wider, and the last months would be spent further apart than Elise and Aldrich had ever been. Elise had to find another way. Elise watched Aldrich and worried and said nothing, which was the hardest thing Elise had ever done. And Elise left the water each night, and some nights Elise stood in the corridor outside the study door for longer than was necessary, just breathing the same air as the room Aldrich was in. And then Elise left. February. The cold had never fully lifted. The collapse happened on a Tuesday. Elise knew it was a Tuesday because Elise had been cleaning the study windows. Elise's Tuesday duty, unchanged across a year and a half. And Elise had gone downstairs for a fresh cloth and was coming back up the main staircase when Elise heard it. Not a fall, exactly. More the particular sound of controlled descent. A man who felt the thing happening and had time to brace against it, to lower himself rather than simply drop. A careful collapse, which was so entirely in keeping with Aldrich that in another circumstance, Elise might have found it almost funny. Elise ran. Elise found Aldrich on the floor of the corridor outside the library, Aldrich's back against the wall. Aldrich's legs extended in front of him, one hand pressed flat against the floor for balance. Aldrich's face was the color of the winter sky outside. Aldrich's breathing was short and concentrated in the way of someone doing mathematics, measuring each breath, accounting for it. Elise was on the floor in front of Aldrich before Elise had made a decision to be. "Aldrich?" Elise said. "Not your grace." Aldrich's name. The first time? Aldrich looked at Elise. Aldrich's eyes were very clear and very gray, and for a moment, Elise thought Aldrich was going to tell Elise to get up, to go and fetch someone, to maintain the correct administrative distance while Aldrich handled this quietly on his own. Elise could see Aldrich considering it. Elise held Aldrich's gaze and did not move. "Don't," Elise said. Meaning, "Don't tell me to leave." Meaning, "Don't manage this without me." Meaning several other things Elise did not have time to catalogue. Aldrich looked at Elise for a moment longer. Then Aldrich let out a slow breath and leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. And that was all. That was the concession. Aldrich did not ask for help, but Aldrich stopped insisting on its absence. Elise stayed on the floor in front of Aldrich until Aldrich's breathing evened out. Elise did not touch Aldrich. Elise had a fine-tuned understanding of Aldrich's limit for physical proximity, and Elise was not going to breach that limit on a corridor floor. Elise just stayed present, close enough that Aldrich could feel the warmth of another person in the cold air of the corridor. After a while, Elise said, "Can you stand?" Aldrich considered this honestly, which was new. "In a moment," Aldrich said. "I'll wait," Elise said. Aldrich did not say thank you. Aldrich never said thank you for anything, Elise had noticed. Elise thought that probably thank you was, for Aldrich, the same category of vulnerability as everything else. Something that acknowledged need, and Aldrich had a profound structural resistance to acknowledging need. Elise had made her peace with this over a long time. Elise helped Aldrich to his feet when Aldrich was ready, and Elise did not make the help feel like help if Elise could help it, which was the particular art of assisting Aldrich Voss. Aldrich walked to the library under his own authority, with Elise 2 steps behind and slightly to one side, available but not intrusive, and Aldrich sat down in the chair near the fire, and Elise built the fire up without asking permission, and then sat in the chair across from Aldrich. Elise and Aldrich sat together in the warm room for an hour. Aldrich did not speak. Elise did not speak. The fire spoke in its way, in the hiss and shift of burning wood, and outside the window, the February light moved slowly through its short arc, and the manor held its silence around Elise and Aldrich, the way the manor always had, but differently, changed by what had just happened on the corridor floor. Changed by Aldrich's name in Elise's mouth, by the fact that Aldrich had heard it and had not corrected it. Elise looked at Aldrich across the fire and thought, "This is not enough time." The thought arrived cleanly and without embellishment, and Elise received it the same way. It was not enough time. Whatever this was, whatever had been building in the silences and the water glasses and the moved boxes and the exact-sized gloves, this thing had not had enough time. The thing had been growing slowly, the way the rosemary grew, with patience and without rushing, and the thing needed more time than it was going to get. And Elise found this to be the most specifically painful thing Elise had experienced in a life that had not been without pain. Elise looked at Aldrich across the fire. Elise thought, "But there is still time now." March arrived, and with it a brief respite, one of those physiological mysteries that no one could explain. The illness easing its grip slightly for a period of weeks, giving Aldrich back some color, some steadiness, some approximation of the energy that had characterized Aldrich even in his worst periods. Elise was cautiously glad for the respite. Elise was also experienced enough with the patterns by now to know that a respite was not a reversal. During those weeks, Aldrich was more present with Elise than Aldrich had ever been. Elise and Aldrich sat in the library in the evening sometimes, which had begun one night when Elise had brought Aldrich's evening tea, and Aldrich had said, with the casual tone of a man proposing something Aldrich had definitely not been thinking about for some time, "You could stay, if you have nothing else." Elise had stayed. Elise and Aldrich had read in the same room, in the same comfortable silence Elise and Aldrich had developed in the East Garden the previous spring. The kind of silence that is not empty, but populated, full of the presence of two people who are at ease in the same space. Aldrich talked to Elise. Not about himself, never that, not directly, but about the books Aldrich was reading, about the history of the estate, about the falcon in the courtyard fountain, which turned out to have been commissioned by Aldrich's grandfather as a personal emblem, and which Aldrich's grandfather had then hated on delivery because the craftsman had made the falcon mid-flight rather than landing, and the old man had found something unbearable about the frozen motion. "My grandfather wanted the falcon in repose," Aldrich said. My grandfather said an animal caught in motion never looked settled." "And you?" Elise asked. Aldrich looked at the fire for a moment. "I think things caught in motion look honest," Aldrich said. Elise looked at Aldrich and thought, "You have no idea what you just said about yourself." Elise looked at Aldrich across the fire in the library on those March evenings and felt something Elise had been circling for a very long time arrive fully and take its place in Elise's chest with the quiet certainty of something that had always been heading here. Elise did not announce it. Elise held it carefully, the way you hold something that is both precious and possibly breakable. And Elise let it exist without forcing it into the shape of something that needed to be said. April came. The respite ended. Elise could feel it before the end of the respite was visible. That atmospheric thing, the heaviness returning, the quality of Aldrich's footstep changing, the light under the study door burning later and later into the night. By the second week of April, the shaking had returned to Aldrich's hands, more pronounced now, and there were afternoons when Aldrich did not come down from the upper floor at all, and Mrs. Holt's face wore the expression of someone who was counting things. Aldrich kept it from Elise. Aldrich kept it from Elise with the dedication of a man who has made a promise to himself and is going to honor that promise regardless of the cost. And the promise was this: Elise would not carry Aldrich's dying. That was not something Aldrich was willing to let Elise do. Elise had given Aldrich, and Aldrich had no clean way to think about what Elise had given Aldrich, no category for it, because the gift was not something Aldrich had expected to receive, and Aldrich did not have the architecture for receiving it gracefully. Elise had given Aldrich something Aldrich had not had in a very long time. The sensation of being a person worth paying attention to. The specific warmth of being known, carefully, by someone who had taken the time to learn the language of Aldrich, rather than asking Aldrich to be easier. Aldrich could not pay that back. Aldrich knew Aldrich could not. Aldrich did not have enough time, and Aldrich did not have the skills, and Aldrich had come too late to all of this, too walled off, too practiced in the wrong kind of management. But Aldrich could do this one thing. Aldrich could arrange his ending so that Elise was not in the room for it. Aldrich could protect Elise from that, and it would be the last and most honest expression of everything Aldrich could not say directly. Aldrich called Mrs. Holt in on a Thursday morning. Aldrich told Mrs. Holt that arrangements needed to be made for a final settlement of staff wages. Aldrich told Mrs. Holt this in the language of administrative necessity, which was the only language Aldrich had ever used with Mrs. Holt for things that were, in fact, not administrative at all. And Mrs. Holt received this in the way Mrs. Holt received all such communications, with perfect professional composure and, underneath it, a grief Mrs. Holt would process privately, later, in her own way. Aldrich called Elise in on a Friday. Elise came to the study and stood across the desk from Aldrich, as Elise had done on that first morning back in October, and Elise looked at Aldrich and saw immediately that something was different. Aldrich was not in his usual posture. Aldrich was sitting slightly back from the desk, with a careful stillness about Aldrich that Elise had come to associate with a particular kind of pain management. the stillness of a man who has learned that certain positions hurt less than others and is choosing accordingly. Aldrich had an envelope on the desk in front of him. Aldrich slid the envelope toward Elise. "Your wages," Aldrich said, "through the end of the agreed year, and an additional sum for the arrangement, the inconvenience of it." Elise looked at the envelope. Elise did not pick it up. Elise looked at Aldrich. Aldrich looked back at Elise, and Elise saw what was happening. Elise saw it clearly, because Elise had spent a year and a half learning to read the things Aldrich would not say. Elise saw that this was goodbye. Aldrich had constructed the goodbye very carefully in the administrative language of end of contract, and Aldrich was going to see Elise out the door with the same controlled efficiency Aldrich applied to everything, and Aldrich was going to die in this manner alone, probably within weeks, and Aldrich had decided this was the correct and generous thing to do. Elise felt a fury rise in Elise that was so clean and so specific, it almost frightened Elise with its clarity. "No," Elise said. Aldrich looked at Elise. "I'm not leaving," Elise said. "The arrangement was for 1 year," Aldrich said. "The year." "I know what the arrangement was," Elise said. "Then you understand?" Aldrich. Aldrich's name, again. The way Aldrich's name fell out of Elise stopped Aldrich entirely. Elise had learned this, that Aldrich's name in Elise's mouth, said directly, without deference or ceremony, landed on Aldrich differently than anything else. "Look at me!" Aldrich was looking at Elise. Aldrich was always looking at Elise. Aldrich looked at Elise with the specific gravity of a man who had been trying not to for a long time and had not been succeeding. "I'm not leaving because you're dying," Elise said. "I know that's what this is. I know that's what you've been doing. All of it. The wages, the settlement, sending me away. I know." The silence in the study was absolute. Aldrich's expression did not break. Aldrich's expression did not crack or collapse. But something in Aldrich's expression shifted. The controlled surface remained, the way the surface of water remains. But beneath it, something moved that Elise could feel, the way you feel current beneath a still-looking river. "Who told you?" Aldrich said. Aldrich's voice was very even. "It doesn't matter," Elise said. "It matters." "It doesn't matter," Elise said, "because even if no one had told me, I would have known. I've been here for 17 months, Aldrich. I know the sound of your bad nights. I know the difference between how you walk on a day when the pain is managed and a day when it isn't. I know." Elise stopped. Elise breathed. "I know you." Aldrich looked at Elise. "You don't get to decide for me," Elise said. "Whether I stay, whether I carry this. You don't get to make that choice on my behalf and call it kindness." Elise's voice had remained very steady, and Elise was proud of that, because Elise's chest was doing something complicated. "You have been making choices on my behalf for a long time. The debt, the arrangement, sending me away the first time so you could be sick alone without me watching. I have let you make those choices because I understood why you were making them, and because I thought it was what you needed." Elise picked up the envelope from the desk. Elise put the envelope back down in front of Aldrich. "But not this one," Elise said. "I will not leave, and I will not let you die in this house alone. That is not something I'm willing to do." The silence lasted a long time. Aldrich looked at the envelope, and then at Aldrich's hands, and then at some middle distance that contained nothing but air and the weight of what had just been said. And Elise watched Aldrich and waited and did not fill the silence. Aldrich said, "Elise." Elise's name in Aldrich's mouth was a different thing from Elise's name spoken anywhere else. Elise had thought, over the months, that this might simply be Elise's own interpretation, that Elise was reading something into inflection that was not there. But Elise was very close to certain, standing in that study with the April light in the windows, that Elise was not imagining it. Aldrich said, "I do not know how to do this." Elise said, "I know." Aldrich said, I am not good at—" Aldrich stopped. Aldrich pressed his hand against his chest very briefly. The gesture so automatic, Elise was not certain Aldrich knew Aldrich had done it. "I have been sick for a long time. I have been managing it in a specific way, and the specific way was alone," Elise said. "Yes," Aldrich said. "I know that too," Elise said. "I'm not asking you to be different than you are. I'm not asking you to stop being the way you are. I'm asking you not to send me away." Elise paused. "That's all?" Aldrich looked at Elise for a very long time, and then Aldrich did something Elise had never seen Aldrich do and had not known Aldrich was capable of. Aldrich unclenched. It was not visible exactly. It was not a slumping of shoulders or a bowing of head. It was something interior, some structural decision to stop holding the thing Aldrich had been holding. And it expressed itself only in Aldrich's eyes. In a very slight change in what Aldrich's eyes were doing. Aldrich's eyes were not closed anymore. Aldrich's eyes were not managing. Aldrich's eyes were just open and looking at Elise, and tired, and real, and present. Aldrich said very quietly, "All right." Elise sat in the chair across from Aldrich. Elise did not speak again. Elise picked up the book that was on the side table and opened it at an arbitrary page and did not read a word of it. Aldrich turned back to his desk and picked up his pen, and Elise was not certain Aldrich used the pen for anything purposeful. The afternoon moved around Elise and Aldrich. Elise was still there when evening came. Elise stayed. May moved slowly and then quickly, the way time moves when you are paying very close attention to it. Elise was with Aldrich through the bad days with the specific kind of presence Elise had always offered. Close but not suffocating, attentive without performing the attention, steady in the way that only certain people can be steady, the ones who have internalized the difference between holding on and simply being there. Elise brought Aldrich what Aldrich could eat, which was not much and became less as the weeks passed. Elise read in the library in the evenings. Elise left the window in Aldrich's bedroom open 2 inches because Aldrich had once mentioned that the cold air helped the breathing, and Elise had remembered. Aldrich talked to Elise more than Aldrich had talked to anyone in years. Not about the illness. Not in the confessional sense Elise supposed Elise had always imagined intimacy with someone like Aldrich would look like. But about everything else. About the history of things. About Aldrich's father, who had been a fair man with a difficulty with warmth that Aldrich had inherited along with the estate. About the portrait at the end of the east corridor that had always slightly unnerved Aldrich because the subject's eyes had been rendered to follow movement, a technique the painter had employed with more skill than judgment. About what Aldrich thought the falcon in the fountain was looking at, positioned as it was, perpetually frozen in its launch. Aldrich said once, looking out the study window at the courtyard below, "West. I've always thought the falcon was looking west. There's nothing west but the road, and then the village, and then more road." Elise said, "Maybe the falcon is looking at where things are going. Not what's there now." Aldrich turned from the window and looked at Elise. Aldrich said, "You think like that." Elise said, "What, about falcons?" Aldrich said, "About everything." And then Aldrich turned back to the window, and Elise turned back to her book, and neither Elise nor Aldrich said anything else. But the room had changed, slightly, in the way rooms change when something true has been said in them, and is still settling. Aldrich gave Elise a look sometimes that Elise had no name for. Elise was not looking for one. Elise was not interested at this point in definitions or categories, or the satisfying resolution of labeling what this was between Elise and Aldrich. Elise was interested in the actual thing, this particular, improbable, fully realized thing between two people who had come to it by the most indirect route imaginable and who were living in it now with the imperfect honesty of two people doing their best with the materials they had. It was enough. Elise told herself it was enough, and Elise believed herself most of the time. Late May, the warmest it had been. Aldrich had been in bed for 2 days. Not confined exactly, but diminished, the body making its slow announcements about remaining resources. Elise sat with Aldrich in the mornings, and Mrs. Holt sat with Aldrich in the afternoons, and Dr. Crane came twice a week now, and left with a face that no longer bothered with composure. On the second evening, Elise was sitting in the chair Elise had moved close to Aldrich's bed. Reading aloud from the book Aldrich had said Aldrich had never gotten around to finishing. A long historical account of an explorer who had spent 20 years mapping coastlines nobody had thought to map before, finding the shapes of things that had always existed but had no names. Elise was reading, and Aldrich was listening with Aldrich's eyes closed, which Elise had come to understand was not indifference, but concentration. Because when Aldrich's eyes were closed, Aldrich was fully present in a way that Aldrich's face sometimes obscured when Aldrich's eyes were open. Elise read until the light went, and then Elise set the book down. The room was quiet. Elise looked at Aldrich in the lamplight. Aldrich was very still. Aldrich's breathing had the quality it had lately, shallow and deliberate, measured, each breath chosen. Elise said Aldrich's name. Aldrich didn't answer. Aldrich's chest was not moving. Elise stood. Elise crossed to the bed in 2 steps. Elise stood over Aldrich and looked at Aldrich's face, which was completely still. And the stillness was the kind that was different from sleep. Elise knew the stillness of Aldrich's sleep. Elise had been in this room enough evenings to know the particular quality of how Aldrich breathed when Aldrich slept versus when Aldrich was awake. And this was not either of those. This was a stillness Elise had not seen before and did not want to interpret correctly. Elise dropped to her knees at the side of the bed. Elise put her hands on Aldrich's chest. Elise said Aldrich's name again, and this time Elise's voice broke on it, which Elise's voice had not done in 17 months of learning to be steady inside of situations that required steadiness. And the break in Elise's voice opened something in Elise that Elise had been holding carefully shut for a very long time. Elise pressed her hands against Aldrich's chest, and Elise put her forehead against her hands, and Elise felt the grief arrive the way weather arrives, completely, all at once, from everywhere, with no remaining negotiation possible between Elise and the fact of it. Elise did not try to stop crying. There was no one watching that Elise needed to hold herself together for. The man who had taught Elise, without meaning to, that you could need someone desperately and not know how to say it. The man who had repaired Elise's window latch and moved Elise's box and left Elise gloves that fit exactly. Aldrich was lying still in front of Elise in a room that smelled of winter and old paper, and the rosemary Elise had brought in a small vase from the garden 3 days ago because Elise thought the smell might help. Elise's tears fell. Elise's tears fell onto Aldrich's chest, through Elise's hands, onto the blanket, and then, slowly, beneath Elise's palms, Elise felt it. A movement. So slight at first that Elise thought Elise had imagined it. The particular cruelty of grief, Elise thought, making Elise feel things that were not there. But Elise raised her head, and Elise looked. Aldrich's chest rose. A small rise, tentative, like something remembering a process it had almost abandoned. Then another. Slow. Careful. Each breath a little more committed than the last. Elise stared. Aldrich's color was changing. Not dramatically. Not the way it happened in stories. Not a sudden flush or a dramatic transformation, but a gradual, incremental shift. The way light shifts at the edge of dawn. Too slow to catch in the moment, but undeniable when you look from what was to what is. Some faint warmth returning to Aldrich's face that had been for months a study in controlled pallor. Aldrich's eyes opened. Aldrich's eyes were gray, as they had always been, but the light in them was different. Elise had last seen this light, Elise realized, in the portrait at the end of the east corridor. The portrait of Aldrich's grandfather as a young man. Before the estate and the responsibility and the generations of careful distance. The light of someone who had not yet learned to extinguish it. Aldrich looked at Elise. Elise was still on her knees at the side of Aldrich's bed, with Elise's hands on Aldrich's chest, and Elise's face a complete record of the past hour. Elise did not try to compose herself. Elise was done composing herself for anyone in this room. Aldrich raised his hand, slowly, with the effort of someone relearning motion. And Aldrich put his hand over Elise's. Aldrich's hand was warm. Aldrich's hand had not been warm in a very long time. Elise registered this fact the way you register a temperature change after so long in the cold that you have stopped expecting anything else. With a disorientation that took a moment to resolve into something Elise could call relief, and then gladness. And then something beyond gladness that Elise did not have a word for in any language Elise had ever been taught. Aldrich said Elise's name, just that, just Elise's name, the way Aldrich had said it in the study, that first time. Not the administrative form, not the corrective form, but Elise's actual name, the one that meant Elise, said with the full weight of someone who has just come back from somewhere very far and is looking at the first specific thing they recognize. Elise said, "I'm here." Aldrich looked at Elise. The room held its silence, but it was the first silence in this house that had felt truly full, not hollow, not the absence of something, but the presence of it. Aldrich said, "You stayed." Elise said, "I told you I would." Aldrich looked at Elise for a long moment with the open eyes of someone who has stopped managing what their face shows, and then Aldrich did something Elise had seen Aldrich do only once before, and in a much less complete way. Aldrich unclenched. Fully this time. The whole architecture of careful distance that Aldrich had built over years and maintained with the dedication of something Aldrich believed was protecting everyone involved. The architecture did not shatter or collapse, because Aldrich was not a man made for shattering. The architecture simply became unnecessary, like scaffolding around a structure that has finally decided to trust its own weight. The morning came through the window with the slowness of May mornings, pale gold and without hurry. Elise was still there. Aldrich was still breathing. Mrs. Holt found Elise and Aldrich when Mrs. Holt came up at 7. Elise in the chair. Elise had moved close to the bed, asleep with her head against the arm of it, and Aldrich awake, looking at the morning light coming through the window with the expression of a man encountering something ordinary for the first time. Mrs. Holt stood in the doorway for a moment. Then Mrs. Holt went back downstairs and told Bernard to make breakfast, a real breakfast, for 2, and Mrs. Holt went to her office and sat down and put her face in her hands and allowed herself, privately and without any audience, to feel everything Mrs. Holt had been managing for years. The rosemary was growing. In the east garden, in the planter that had once held Aldrich's mother's herbs, the rosemary grew now in the way of something that had decided it would be here for a long time. Not aggressively, not with the show of something trying to prove a point, but with the steady, gray-green insistence of a plant that has simply concluded that this is where the plant belongs, and sees no reason to revisit the question. Aldrich came to the garden in the weeks that followed. Aldrich came with more steadiness than Aldrich had walked anywhere in months. The illness had not disappeared. It did not work that way. The body does not simply reverse what has been happening in it for years. But something had changed at a level that when Dr. Crane came for a weekly appointment in early June, and found Aldrich sitting in the east garden in the morning sun with considerably more color in Aldrich's face than Dr. Crane had any medical explanation for, could not account for, and did not try to, being a practical man who had long since learned that medicine could not hold all the variables. Aldrich sat across the garden from Elise, in the way Elise and Aldrich had always occupied outdoor space together. Separate but aware of each other, with the specific awareness of two people who have developed a private language out of shared proximity. Elise was tending the rosemary. Aldrich was reading, or not reading, the book open in Aldrich's lap at the same page the book had been on for 20 minutes. Elise said, without looking up, "You're not reading." Aldrich said, "I'm aware." Elise said, "What are you doing?" A pause. Aldrich said, "Looking at the garden." Elise looked up at Aldrich. Aldrich was not looking at the garden. Elise felt her mouth curve. Elise turned back to the rosemary. Aldrich said, "Elise." Elise said, "Yes." Aldrich said, "I want to say something, and I need you not to make it difficult." Elise set down the gardening cloth. Elise turned and looked at Aldrich fully. Aldrich was looking back at Elise with the open eyes, the ones Elise had first seen that night, the ones that had not gone away since. And Aldrich was holding his book very carefully in both hands, the way you hold something when your hands need something to do. Aldrich said, "I know that I have not, that I am not." Aldrich stopped. Aldrich looked at the rosemary for a moment and then back at Elise. "I am not good at saying things directly. I think you know this." Elise said, "I know this." Aldrich said, "The years I've been sick, I spent those years learning how to need nothing. I thought it was the right way. I thought it was the responsible way. If you need nothing, you cannot lose anything. You can manage everything. You can—" Aldrich stopped again. Aldrich breathed once, carefully. "You can die alone, and no one suffers for it but you." Elise was very still. "I didn't account for it," Aldrich said. "I didn't account for the possibility that someone would—" Another pause, the longest one, and Elise waited through all of it. "That someone would stay, and learn, and bring water, and know the difference between how I walk on a good day and a bad day, and not say anything about it, just be there." Elise said nothing. Elise let Aldrich's words come. Aldrich said, "I don't have language for what I'm trying to say. I want to be clear about that. I am telling you this because you should know. You should have some direct, honest version of this. From me, with my actual words, and not some administrative substitute." Aldrich looked at Elise. "What you are to me is not something I have a name for. I have looked for one. I have not found one that is large enough." Elise looked at Aldrich across the garden in the June light. Elise said, "You don't need a name for it." Aldrich looked at Elise. Elise said, "I know what it is. I've known for a while." Aldrich said, "And?" Elise said, "And I'm still here." Aldrich looked at Elise for a long moment with the open eyes and the morning light on Aldrich's face, and the book closed now in Aldrich's lap, because the book had been an excuse for quite some time, and Elise and Aldrich had both known it. Then Aldrich said, very quietly, with the particular accuracy of a man who has finally found the word he was looking for, "Yes, you are." The garden was quiet. The rosemary grew. Aldrich was not the same man as the one who had stood at the window and watched Elise walk down the drive in June of the previous year. Aldrich was not suddenly easy or warm or comfortable with the full range of human expression. Aldrich was still precise and still prone to silence, and still occasionally found social performance to be an energy expenditure Aldrich could not justify. But there was no wall where the wall had been. The architecture had changed. Where there had been distance, there was now simply space, and the space was shared, and no one was managing it. The household noticed. Ruth mentioned to old Garrett one morning in the kitchen over something Bernard was making too much noise to hear, that Ruth had seen Aldrich in the garden yesterday helping with the planter. Not helpfully, Ruth added, out with the practical assessment of someone who had observed Aldrich's technique, but present and willing, which Ruth had never seen Aldrich be with any task that was not directly tied to the running of the estate. Garrett listened to this and said nothing for a moment, and then Garrett said, "Elise stayed." With the same emphasis Garrett had always given that fact, which was the emphasis of someone who knew that staying was the whole story. Mrs. Holt, who overheard this from the corridor and chose not to make her presence known, walked back to her office and sat down and thought about a girl who had arrived on a December morning with snow in her hair and a canvas bag, and an expression that had already done the work of expecting difficulty. Mrs. Holt allowed herself to smile, privately, without audience. At the end of June, on an evening when the light lasted until very late and the east garden was lit with it, warm and gold and long, Aldrich came to where Elise was sitting on the stone bench near the rosemary planter. Aldrich stood for a moment. Then Aldrich sat beside Elise. Aldrich sat close enough that Aldrich's arm touched Elise's arm. Aldrich did not move away. Elise did not move away. Elise and Aldrich sat together in the long evening light, and the garden held its quiet around them, and the rosemary smelled of warm summer and patience and the specific persistence of things that intend to be somewhere for a long time. Aldrich reached over. Aldrich took Elise's hand. Aldrich did not say anything. Elise did not say anything. There was nothing left to say that the hand did not already say more precisely, and Elise and Aldrich were both by now fluent in the language of the things that did not require words. The iron falcon in the courtyard stretched its wings toward the west, frozen in motion, but this time the falcon looked, to anyone who cared to read it, less like something trapped than something about to be released. In the end, it wasn't power that saved Aldrich Voss. It wasn't medicine, though medicine had tried. It wasn't the estate or the money or the carefully maintained control of every variable Aldrich could reach. It wasn't even time, because time had been running in the wrong direction for years and had not changed course out of mercy. It was the particular, stubborn, patient love of Elise Morin, a woman who had learned Aldrich's language without being taught it, who had brought water to a door that would not open and stayed by a bed when Aldrich had ordered Elise not to, who had planted rosemary in his mother's planter and said things usually do when Aldrich told Elise it would take years to grow into something worth having. It was love Aldrich had never dared to show. It was love Elise had seen anyway. And that, in the end, was the whole story.